Where are the 12 tribes of Israel today? Are they still around? Many people believe that they were dispersed among the nations, but is that true? Now, when you read Genesis 49, the entire chapter, you find that Jacob is telling his 12 sons what they would be at the end time. He gave them characteristics and he gave them symbols. So we're going to be using history, the identifying characteristics, and their symbols to help identify these tribes today. Now, according to Genesis 49, Jacob told his sons that they would still be around at the last days. Genesis 49:1, and Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourself together, and I will tell you that which shall befall you in the last days." So that establishes the fact that they still should be around today. Now, the famous historian Josephus tells us that they lived just beyond the Euphrates River. The 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates River till now and are an immense multitude not to be estimated by numbers. And we know that across the Euphrates River was the country of Parthia. Parthia would fall in 226 AD to the Persians. And according to their historian, George Rawlins, they moved into the northern part of Europe, which is called Scythia. Now, the Encyclopedia Britannica tells us the main movement from Asia into Europe, which went north of the Caspius, was in early times that of the Scythians. So what it's saying is that Scythians would be the tribes that would move into Europe. And they would come in as the Germanic tribes. We're going to use the Germanic tribes' history, characteristics, and symbols to identify these people. Most of these tribes around the 1st century were already in the area of Germany. And they crossed into Gaul and settled in Italy and France and Belgium and Netherlands. And they had highly concentrated in the area of Gaul by really the 3rd century. We want to talk about some of those tribes today. So what we're going to do is start with the tribe of Reuben, which were the Franks. Now, the first king that we want to note among the Franks was Maverick. He lived in northern Gaul, and he ruled during that 3rd century. And he eventually passed his succession down to his son called Childeric. And Childeric was the one that beat back the Visigoths to take over southern Gaul. Now, he was stripped of his kingship and sent back to Germany where his original family was because he was a womanizer. He thought being king gave him the right to take other men's wives and daughters. Eventually, Childeric, he would have to be brought back. The Franks eventually had to ask him to return because they were losing ground to the Goths and to the Romans. So once they saw that he needed to restore order, they brought him back. Now, his son was Clovis. He was the one that brought the Catholic faith into France or into Gaul. Now, Clovis united all of Gaul under the Franks, and that took him about 30 years. So he was a great warrior. Now, he married a queen which was from the Burgunders, and that's where he got his Catholic faith. He made all of his army get baptized in the Catholic faith. There was like 2,000 of them. So he became indoctrinated, and this is not uncommon to see some of these tribes start turning away from their original faith. We want to talk about, as we pointed out in Reuben's history, he would have a weakness for women, and it would cost him dearly. He lost his birthright because he slept with his father's concubine. And we just mentioned how Clovis, under the influence of his wife, would cause France to leave their original faith. Now, this is why Reuben is considered unstable as water. I guess I better mention some things about Reuben, and that is that he has 2 symbols. And those 2 symbols are a picture of a man, a face of a man, and the other one is water. That was his symbol that he was given by Jacob. Genesis 29:32, Leah conceived and bare a son and named him Reuben, and she said, "Surely the Lord has looked upon my affliction, and now therefore my husband will love me." So his name meant seeing in Genesis 49. Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my mighty, and the beginning of my strength, and the excellency of dignity, and the excellence of power. So Reuben was always to have power over some of the other nations, and that you can see that in history. Now, verse 4, he was as unstable as water. That's why he has the symbol of water. Thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, and thou defiled thou it, and went up to my couch. Now Reuben would be the oldest of the sons, and his symbol would be the fleur-de-lis. Now Genesis 49:3 says he would be strong, mighty, and have power. Genesis 49:4 says he would be unstable as water. Now on his flag he had a mandrake, and that was a flower. So he has the symbol of the fleur-de-lis, and sometimes it's called the water lily. Now Reuben would be found in France, and you will see the fleur-de-lis on all of their coat of arms. The 13th century, the 15th century, and the House of Bourbon. Now we're told in history that Rome fell to a tribe called the Visigoths. What we're not told is the Visigoths were a tribe of Israel. So how do we know these people that were the Visigoths and the Goths were Israelites? First of all, they came out of Scythia, so we know that they were Israelites. So how do we know which tribe they came from? And they came from the tribe of Gad. We're going to prove that next. Now Gad's mother was Zilpah, and he was the firstborn of Zilpah.
Genesis chapter 30, verses 9, 10, and 11. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "A troop comes." So she called his name Gad.
So my question is, how did Leah know the destiny of Gad? And why would he name him Troop? Now in Genesis 49:19, the 12 sons of Israel received their blessings.
Gad, a troop shall tramp upon him, but he shall triumph at last.
Now, isn't that interesting? A troop shall overcome him. That is in reference to the Huns taking and pushing the Goths out of Scythia. In the latter part of that verse, it says, and he shall overcome at the last. So God had predestined the tribe of Gad to take down the Roman Empire. That he would fall to an earlier power, and then he would take down and overcome his enemy. And this is exactly what the Goths did. Now the Goths lived in the area around the Black Sea and lived there since their exile from the land of Israel. This was the area that the Scythians had lived for centuries. This was where the 12 tribes of Israel originally settled after the fall of the northern tribes of Israel in 721 BC. Originally, they were just simple farmers by trade, not warriors. The Goths were pushed out of their land in Scythia by the Huns' invasion from the east. In the 3rd century, the Goths moved under the Blue Danube as refugees. They asked the Roman Emperor Valens for asylum, and Rome agreed in return for their services in the emperor's army. They were assigned to refugee camps. Now, it's important to mention that the Romans treated the Goths very cruelly and didn't give them enough food. Now the Goths were literally starving to death. Now it's funny how all the historians record that these people turned to their religion, which basically tells us that they repented and returned to God. In their outrage against the cruel treatment by the Romans, they organized an attack, Marcus Opal, and it turned out to be a massive slaughter. Starving and desperate, they attacked village after village, leaving them ravaged and burned many to the ground. They actually sacked Athens, the Byzantine, and Sparta. Now at that time, Sparta was probably the greatest fighting force in the world, and these Goths had no difficulty bringing down Sparta. The Greeks and the Romans both hated the Israelite tribes, or the Goths that came in there. And so they called them barbarians and they called them pagans. And they were neither. They were neither pagans or barbarians. Now, by that point, the Goths had been trained in military tactics by the Romans, so they knew what the Romans would do when they went to battle. The people at that time called Alaric Moses. And in 408, Alaric worked his way across Italy. And in 410 AD, Alaric marched into Rome and sacked the city. Now, for the first time, the Israelites who have been fighting Rome for over 600 years in Parthia finally had a victory over Rome. They had completely crushed the Romans. Now, Byzantine Empire had been ran from Constantinople from the time of Constantine, which was 320. Many of them did flee to the Byzantine Empire. For the first time in history, the Israelites had overcome their enemy totally, and that was the Roman Empire, just as prophecy said would happen. Now, in history, the tribe of Gad was known as the Visigoths, and they would move down into Spain and live in the area of Spain, and then they would move back up into southern France and into southern Germany. And notice the coat of arms for Spain, for Castile, for Gibraltar, and for Spain and Portugal all have castles on them, which was the symbol for Gad. Now also note that the coat of arms for France has a tent on it, and that was another symbol for Gad. Now the tribe of Simeon never received a land inheritance. And it says that Genesis 49:5, Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. They were a cruel people. It says, cursed be their anger, for they were fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So they never received a land inheritance. But you would see their symbol, which is the sword, all through all the other Israelite countries. And it's interesting because as a Germanic tribe, they were called the Lombards, and they lived basically in the area around Germany. Now, the Romans knew of their military skill, and they hired them as mercenaries to go in and take Italy. And they went in, it was just an absolute bloodbath. And the Romans were so outdone and so outraged by the cruel tactics of the Lombards that they sent them home. They stopped the campaign and sent them home. So you can imagine if the Romans are disgusted at how bad this really was, what kind of bloodbath this actually was. Now, after that campaign, the Lombards realized Italy was theirs for the taking. They came back to their land and they said, well, you know, we can go in and take Italy. We don't have to involve the Romans at all, which is exactly what they did. And they were opposed to the Catholics that were in the southern Italy. The Pope asked for the assistance of Charlemagne. Charlemagne came in and took over Italy and conquered Italy. Now, I think that's interesting because at that point, the Lombards lost control of Italy and to their brother, the Franks, because it's really fulfilling that scripture that we just talked about that said they would not have their own land. They would be scattered through the other nations. So from that point on, they became scattered in the other nations. Now, when you look at the coat of arms for the different nations, a lot of times you will see a sword. And that will tell you that some of Simeon's descendants are in that land. And it's very common to see that sword. Now,